Good evening, everyone. If you have just arrived for the event, please do come in. There are still some seats over there, and there's also an aisle in between, so you won't have to climb over anyone. Thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all here to the space, particularly for the launch of a debut novel, which is always particularly exciting. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight with many thanks to the publishers Turnstone/Ravenstone Press to launch the debut Cli-Fi thriller Bounty by Jason Pchajek. This is a book that rockets us 100 years into the future in Winnipeg and deals with a nest of bounty hunters located here within the city. One of those things where reading the book at first, I thought, why Winnipeg? And then very cleverly realized, oh, that's why. It's an incredibly thrilling and very well thought out book as well, and a really fascinating look at a potential future. But you'll be hearing more from the author himself to talk about that in just a moment. Now, Jason Pchajek himself is a writer, a journalist, a radio host, and a corporate researcher from Winnipeg. When he's not working on his next project, Jason spends his time reading, playing video games, and preparing for his next D&D session. Bounty is his debut novel. He'll be reading from the podium. There'll be a conversation between him and your host for this evening, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And then following that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. When it comes time for the Q&A, and if you do have a question, please just put up your hand and I'll run over to you with the microphone. Not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that anybody watching at home can hear your question. And if you are one of those people watching at home and have any questions for Jason, please just write them in the chat. We'll put them to him as time permits. Your host for this evening, GMB Chomichuk, is an award-winning writer and illustrator whose work has appeared in role-playing games, film, television, and theater, comics, graphic novels, and books. He is the host of Super Pulp Science, a podcast about how genre gets made. His work in words and pictures ranges from the heartwarming to the blood-curdling. Look for his gripping, alternate future action-packed page-turners, The Automatic Age, and The Backbone of Night, and watch The Shadows for his sword and sorcery tales of the Once Lands in the upcoming new collection, Shared World, which will be launching here on November 29th. You can find all of his books and graphic novels at gmbchomichuk.ca. We'll be hearing from Gregory in just a few moments, but for now, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jason Pchajek.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I'm going to start where all stories do at chapter 1. I try my best not to kill people. Believe me, I do. Usually I give them a chance to surrender, come quietly, let me slap the cuffs over their wrists and end things without bloodshed. There's no point in spilling blood if you don't have to, and I wasn't in the habit of taking lives unnecessarily. But making sure everyone gets out alive is tough when your job is dangerous. It's even harder when your job is a bounty hunter. Soft hiss announced the arrival of fresh spray of mist over the bustling city, adding to the humidity and the scent of wet stone and steel. The airborne water reflected the LED and holo-projected billboards dotting the buildings, pooled on the surface of glossy solar catchers, and danced off the slowly rotating personal wind turbines, making the already shimmering metropolis glow even brighter. But while the watery haze gave the nighttime glow of Winnipeg a dreamlike quality, it did little to relieve the suffocating heat trapped down here in the bowels of the city. I was perched atop a sign, crouched low and invisible within a darkened alcove, scanning the area below me, waiting for my target to emerge. The guide led me all over the lower levels of the city on a wild goose chase that finally brought me to the core, the Devil's Den, bounty hunter territory. A police cruiser rumbled slowly through the air ahead of me, turbine-powered engines in place of wheels baying out into the night, spotlights scanning left and right over the crowd below. They wanted the populace to know they were watching, but everyone knew that they wouldn't dare put boots on the ground this far down without a good reason. As the cruiser rumbled out of sight, I could hear the cops call down to a pair of teens peering over the edge of the walkway, warning them they'd be fined if they kept throwing things down below. In response, the pair gave the cops the finger and walked off. The cruiser kept moving. If it had been 90 years ago, that slight would have meant the kids eating pavement with a boot on their neck, but in the 2120s, the police knew they should just take it. These were the sublevels after all. Kilometers below the surface on sublevel 11, the lowest habitable level of the city, the police presence was no more than a token force, buzzing around, but rarely setting foot outside their flying cruisers to do any real peacekeeping. You're more likely to get shot by a shop owner when robbing a store than getting cuffs slapped on your wrists. Then again, it was equally likely the same shop owner would be shot while the perp escaped, only for the judgment for their crime to fall, eventually, to people like me. With my target taking so long, I finally got a chance to catch my breath and look out at the city I called home. From the alcove where I crouched between a pair of residential towers, I drank in the claustrophobia-inducing crush of glass and steel that comprised the sublevels. Huge spire-like buildings extended from the floor of the sublevels to the ceiling in uninterrupted blocks, connected by a web of walkways, roads, platforms, and railways, filled with people skittering across the floor like ants or buzzing through the sky in transports on AI-determined flight paths. The building I was perched on faced perhaps the most open of spaces in the immediate vicinity, one of the sublevel shafts that stretched from the surface above down to the bottom level of Winnipeg. The tangle of residential buildings and sprawling civic districts picked up again on the other side of the shaft, but from where I sat, the real stars of the show were the hundreds of towering black Argite columns gleaming in the light. Wherever in the city you were, these trademark mineralized carbon supports would be near, extending the entire depth of the metropolis through each sublevel ceiling and floor all the way to the surface. Argite cores could be found lining the city's outermost walls too, improving the structural integrity of the bedrock and allowing the existing geology to hold up the ever-expanding mass that was Winnipeg. Long Argite supports that braced the columns at various angles provided further surface area for buildings and walkways to cling to, giving the city the distinct appearance of an attic taken over by a hive. It was an impressive sight, but after spending most of my life here, I was used to it. The Argite, the heat, the tension, the cramped space, breathing recycled air, drinking recycled water, using recycled ammunition was all normal, natural, home. I relaxed slightly, shifting the rifle slung across my back, sliding down the wall into a sitting position and letting my feet dangle in front of the flickering LEDs below me. I propped the gun on my knees, sliding the barrel shroud forward to inspect the internals. The small electromagnets that lined the barrel hummed quietly with energy, ready to fling the round of recycled materials at whatever I decided to point the weapon at. I learned long ago to inspect my weapons carefully, as a buildup of debris could stunt the charge and leave the gun unable to fire. Satisfied, I pulled the shroud back, hearing an audible click, and turned the weapon to check the status light, which held green, charged, primed, and ready to rock. I fired an old gas-operated firearm once, probably a decade ago at this point. They were almost non-existent, phased out in favor of the greener, electromagnetically propelled weapons, so ubiquitous now. And cartridge bullets weren't made anymore anyway, so even if you could find such a firearm, you'd have to find a stockpile of old ammo to make it worthwhile. Pulling the weapon up to a near-ready position, I took a deep breath. The thick, humid air around me filled my lungs, giving me a sensation of drowning. The air was so tantalizingly close, imminent relief from yet another heat dome that had settled over top the province. Clouds had been gathering at the surface, ready to burst and bring forth the torrential downpour that always followed. It was like the city was holding its breath. Pressure rising, sublevels, a metal and stone box of sweltering heat, the whole place crying out for release. Perhaps it was just me. Each deep, calming exhalation pushed a blast of warm air through the skull-like mouthpiece of my mask. Beads of perspiration streaked down the sides of my face. My clothes were soaked through with sweat from a day wandering the humid alleyways and rooftops of the sublevels, pelted by the routine spray of recycled moisture meant to stem the wretched heat, chasing a guy I was sure would be coming along this way. My wrist nav sparked to life with a couple of flashes, and the heads-up display of my helmet blinked on to show the image of a hawk-faced man scowling at the lucky officer taking his mugshot. His hair came together in a widow's peak as sharp as the point of his nose, accentuating the piercing stare of his black eyes. The Bounty Commission has sent along an update for us. The computerized voice of my AI companion Odin began, sounding a tad annoyed. They want to remind you that our target's name is Ivan Sobotka, a mid-level fixer with ties to multiple anti-establishment groups, wanted for tampering with probation implants and illicit sale of corporate property. Same conditions as before. Odin paused before he gave a slight satisfied hum. Well, now we know why he was given to us. Apparently he was hired to broker the sale of a tablet stolen from an Argo employed contractor who was testing recycled water samples on sublevel 7. It's good to finally know, I replied. High quality corporate tech was a big ticket black market item, especially when it came from Argo, the gatekeepers of the city's environmental infrastructure. The commission know who the seller and buyer are? Odin paused again, reviewing the data. The buyer is unknown, but according to recent CCTV footage from sublevel 7, the seller was someone connected to the Planeswalkers. That made sense to me. The Planeswalkers essentially had the run of legitimate and illegitimate business on sublevel 7. It was their turf. What sealed it was the footage. Pulling up the cliff on my HUD, I was met with the local security feed outside a known Planeswalker greenhouse and watched a man exit the front door right into the path of Sobotka, where the pair collided. The angry shouting that followed, complete with rude gestures tossed back and forth, did nothing to hide the pair bumping their wrist nabs together to complete their clandestine transaction. Unfortunately, the Planeswalker was in a spot where the camera feeds couldn't see his face clearly, so getting a positive ID was impossible. Regardless, it was a fixer selling corporate tech stolen from a contractor working in the city's environmental maintenance infrastructure, standard Eco-Terror Taskforce job. Underneath the description and last known location of Sobotka, in big red text blinked the words "wanted, dead or alive." For the kind of crimes Sobotka was wanted for, legislation dictated his bounty should be alive only. With a rap sheet longer than my arm, Sobotka wasn't given as much leeway. This wasn't his first rodeo fencing stolen corporate tech and tampering with implants, not by a long shot. But he also had some more serious crimes in his history. Assaulting peacekeepers like myself was the big one. So the Bounty Commission was assuming there'd be more risk and wanted to give me an option to do this quickly, quietly, and safely. Safer for me, that is. Despite the dead option, I had every intention of taking Sobotka alive. It was a matter of principle. Dropping him here from across the street with a well-placed rifle round would have been easy, but I wasn't known for taking the easy route. Besides, as a member of the Bounty Commission Eco-Terror Taskforce, knowing who was trying to get their hands on Argo property and why was part of the job, and you can't question someone if they're dead. In any case, after a day of tracking through oppressive heat and moisture, a chase would be just enough to knock me out when this was all done, and Lord knows I needed sleep. Sobotka sure wasn't making it easy for me. Normally, I would have set Odin to comb through security cam footage and social media to try and find him. But it seemed that along with tampering with his probation chip to dampen the signal, he'd installed ID masking tech, a dermal implant that seamlessly hid the man within the pixels of every frame of footage. It was expensive black market tech, not to mention annoying as hell for bounty hunters. So I was out of luck until I got a tip. It was Tuesday. Somewhat innocuous detail on the surface, but growing up the son of a lawyer, you learn to appreciate small details, especially when you hunt people for a living. After a brief conversation with his probation officer, a stressed out, overworked, and underpaid young woman on sublevel 8, I learned that Sobotka had dinner with his mother every Tuesday. Come rain, snow, sleet, or bounty hunter hot on your tail. Following that lead, I hedged my bets and came up golden. He was inside, so it seemed my persistence would finally pay off. Move on to the discussion portion.
Done. Oh, great and powerful laws. Oh, great and powerful laws. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look at all those faces. I know. Look each one in the eye. Remember which ones owe you money. Oh, I know.
Okay, welcome. Good job.
Thank you.
Now, I was whispering it into the microphone, but for those of you joining us online who cannot see the assembled crowd, I think it's important for an author who is in the debut position to take a moment, because it will never come again. The first book launch
Mhm.
is special.
Yeah.
Not because it's all that great, honestly. The first one can be full of all kinds of tumultuous, trembling moments where you wonder, did I do it right? But it's the first in a long path of an author. And I think it's important for those assembled here for debut authors reading to know that in a country like Canada, let's average conservatively 40 million people. Let's say 1 million of them today thought maybe I should write a novel. Maybe 100,000 started. Maybe 1,000 got as far as 1,000 words. Maybe 100 get to a rough draft. Maybe 12 get to a final draft. So this is not an accomplishment that those of you out there should take too lightly. This is a rare type of person here before you, because it takes a certain amount of bravery to publish a book, but an enormous amount of bravery to publish that first book. And so I would love it if you could join me in a round of applause for that moment. So, Jason, now the hard stuff. You ready?
All the questions.
The question period. Okay, well, the first thing that I want to point out is that we are in a first position here. So let's think about the first things that have happened.
Mhm.
You've had your first reading here at McNally Robinson, the first time to be introduced by John Kay's dulcet tones.
Yes.
You've had your first moment of wondering, am I reading on the right page? You've had your first press release. Have you had your first good review?
Yes, I've had one 5-star review on Goodreads so far, so
What about your first bad review?
nothing yet.
Nothing yet. It's out there.
I will
It's
say I
lurking,
have been checking.
right? An important note, I think, is that to know as a writer that writing is not the reason that publishing exists. It's sort of the other way around, it can seem to the reader. But the truth is that publishing is a byproduct of the writer's efforts. And so I'm sure you have a few drafts hidden around. This is maybe your first published work, but I would love to talk first about a very early moment that I picked up while lurking among your family members. Just as we pointed out that writing is about standing apart, let's go way back to your kindergarten class.
My mom loves telling the story, by the way.
Where I heard that your fascist kindergarten teacher insisted that the shoes all be toe to the wall, and that was just a few too many rules for you?
Yes, one rule was a little bit too much for me.
Just too much.
At that time, being 5 years old and not really seeing the point in, like, what function does this serve other than me just doing what you tell me to do?
See, the reason I bring this up is because later I'm going to ask your family what that teacher's name was. And then I'm going to take my digital copy of your book that the publisher provided, and I'm going to do a little name search, little word search, and see if they've been eviscerated by fiction. Because watch out, he's a writer now. I'd love to talk process. I think that it's really important when you're unpacking the steps that go into what a book is about to first talk about how the book came about.
Yeah.
So why don't you give us a day in the life of you, Jason, the author?
Just kind of the average day,
Yeah.
writing on anything?
The best day.
Okay, a productive day.
The worst ones will emerge in this conversation, I promise.
Yeah, well, I think the process is pretty simple. You know, obviously I have a 9-to-5 day job, and writing is kind of my break from the day. So usually at the end of my work day, I'll switch from one screen to the other screen because I work from home. And usually I definitely follow more in like the Stephen King tradition of, you have a word count you want to get to every single day. It doesn't matter if it takes 30 minutes or 3 hours, you're going to get there.
Wait, you started with discipline?
Well,
Okay, that's where.
when I get to decide that it's discipline and it's my discipline, then it's a little bit easier. But when somebody tells me to do something, there's a little bit of pushback.
So do you reread the previous day's writing, or do you just carry on from memory?
Oh, I'll read like the last sentence and just keep on going. It's a very evolving process. I think I'm not the kind of person who sits down and has like the flow chart of like every chapter and what goes in here and here and here in the sequence of events. It's more, I have the starting point and I kind of let the story tell itself and let the characters decide where the narrative goes. I've got ideas about like, okay, this is where the story is going to end. These are a few beats that I have to hit, but really, every kind of moment-to-moment decision has to be what the character would do in the moment, and that really determines the flow of the narrative.
So 2 points for the dear listener here. In the business, we often separate authors between plotters and pantsers. Pantsers because you write by the seat of your pants, you discover at that moment, you figure out what's happening, and you just respond to it on the page. So you would fall into the pantser.
Definitely, yeah.
All right. Now, was this something that developed over the course of your writing practice, where in order to keep it fresh, you would just make it up along the way, or, you know?
I think so. I mean, it's kind of just how my brain tends to work when I'm exploring ideas and topics. I kind of just start going and I see kind of what falls out of my brain at any given time. I think it's funny that I now work in business and corporate research, and there's a lot of structure implied in that, and you know, making decisions and following rules and templates and all of these things.
I think is your business acumen, where this notion of the 3 tiers of society, those who make money, those who move the money, and those protective the rights of the money sort of show up.
Yeah.
But back to the idea of plot, how do you write a mystery? By making it up as you go.
Well, you kind of have to know where the mystery ends and kind of the underlying pieces of it. So I know kind of what the mystery is and where kind of the end point is and what the reveal of that mystery is going to be, but the character doesn't know. So they're kind of going along, and every chapter, every step that they take is somebody trying to figure out this mystery. And I think, okay, what would a person in this position, with the knowledge that they have and the tools at their disposal, what would they do to try and figure out what's going on and react in the most realistic way possible?
Well, that's good for characters, but my question then is, what do you have against Winnipeg? Why would you put Winnipeg through what you've put it through in this story?
I'm sorry to Winnipeg, because I love the city, and I think the decision to set the book in Winnipeg really comes from, I guess, kind of 2 points, right? The first one is that in cyberpunk fiction and science fiction in general, Canada in general is really underrepresented. A lot of the stories, they concern themselves with the plight of the United States and their, great empire of, domination of the world and discourse and what Americans think.
We're looking at you, William Gibson.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to tell a science fiction narrative from a Canadian's perspective, set in Winnipeg, to give this country its due in terms of a seat at the table when it comes to cyberpunk and climate fiction and science fiction more generally. And then the other piece was that I'm from Winnipeg and I'm interested in Winnipeg stories, and I love the city that I grew up in.
So you turned it into a deep pit filled with criminals, cyber terrorists, madmen.
Yeah.
That's what we do, the things we love.
Exactly.
Wait till we find out the
challenge
teacher's name. When you are writing a story, this is not an insubstantial first book either, I might add. I would be curious to know, I am mildly obsessed with drafting numbers when I'm talking to authors. Where does this land? How many different versions of this book were there before it went into people's hands? I just want them to really appreciate the effort.
There were about 5 or 6 different drafts that I went through. There was the initial draft that I wrote way back in 2016, and then I evolved that draft, so that's draft 2, and then there's the 6 or 7 drafts that I wrote with the team over at Turnstone that kind of went from this beginning project. It was a lot shorter, that first draft, and it kind of just continued up. I know you're supposed to, the whole editing and drafting process, you're supposed to cut it down, but I just kind of saw the page count rising up until it was 500 something pages. And
I was going to ask that. Some people on the drafts, they take it out, and other people put it in.
Yeah.
So you add.
I definitely add, and it's probably something I need to work on.
I also noticed you use the term team,
Yes.
not enemy or adversary, or you didn't say editor, that undertone, but team. What was that like to work with Turnstone?
It was awesome.
Yeah.
I think basically from day one, I came home from work and had a conversation on the phone with Jameis, and he talked me through kind of what the process is.
Was it a slush pile? Was it a direct submission? How did that all go? For those people who are out there wondering how the magic happens.
Yeah, so I queried with a bunch of different publishers. I don't have an agent, so I had to do it all myself. And at a certain point, I was thinking, well, this is really a Canadian story, but at its heart, it's a very Winnipeg story. And there's references in it that I think will be special for people who live in the city and know the city. So I decided, hey, why don't I try and go to some indie publishers here in Winnipeg, and Turnstone was kind of at the top of the list. So I sent off the submission, and over a little while, there was a pandemic that kind of threw things off for a little bit. But it kind of all seemed to fall into place, and the values and the kind of the ethos of Turnstone and what they look for in terms of growing art and writing in Manitoba and lifting up Manitoba voices, that really spoke to me. And that one conversation with James on the phone, I was like, all right, this is it. These are the people that I want to work with. And basically the entire process, the feedback on all the drafts was fantastic. Really the decision to go in the Cli-Fi direction came from...
You preempted my next question.
Okay.
Carry on. Keep going.
It came from Melissa, who was my editor, and we're working on drafts, and she kind of said, there's a lot here that this looks like it'd be the perfect story to kind of pivot into this emerging genre of climate fiction. And I'm sure my parents can tell you, I wore out our DVD of An Inconvenient Truth when I was a kid. I kept telling them that I was doing it for a school project. I'm sorry, I lied. I just wanted to keep the movie because I thought it was interesting. So I've always had this interest in climate change, and how our world is evolving due to our influences on it. And I was like, okay, let's do this. I can see where the pieces are falling into place, and it really took on a life of its own after that point. And here we are.
Okay, those were the easy questions. This
Yes.
is a tricky one now.
Mm-hmm. What is my social insurance number?
I
don't know.
The book seems to address the idea of climate being this important, overarching, necessary ecosystem that we rely on.
Yeah.
And yet life is cheap in this world.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile that in the narrative structure? And, a book is not one thing to all people. A book is a lot of levels, and you can write things that are fun and interesting and exciting, and they can also mean something at the same time. So we'll unpack that a little for us.
Yeah, so I think at its heart, it was originally a traditional cyberpunk story. So it had to do a lot with corporate greed and how people are treated as just numbers, and the way that our world is set up. And the original idea behind the book being, what's Winnipeg going to look like in the future if we continue down this path of neoliberal economic policies where It's kind of the old, you got to do the work yourself. No one's going to pay for this, that, and the other thing to help you out when things are going wrong. So like, what's the natural outcome of that? And in this world, it's something that we're already seeing where, we've got the oil and gas industry here in Canada lobbying the federal government to give them money to change over from oil and gas and coal to green alternatives. Basically, give us the public's money that you were going to give to the public and spend on roads and healthcare and education and all these great things. Give it to us so we can then go and do the thing that the public wants us to do, but we don't want to pay for. And this world this ethos continuing on, and it's a natural outcome that climate and our environment is just going to be another thing that gets bought and sold to the highest bidder. And it's more about what turns a profit and what helps maintain this profit generating system when the whole planet is on the line. And it's, you save the world, because if you don't save the world, then who's going to pay for your products and, buy the new car, buy the new iPhone, pay for this new subscription? So
keep the world running so we can charge it for running.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell me about, if it's not too much of a spoiler, the children of Atlantis.
Yes.
The Atlanteans, and the role that religion and mythology play in what is essentially a techno thriller on the surface, but there are so many references to mythology.
Yeah, and so climate fiction as a genre is one that kind of reckons with how is humanity going to respond to the challenges of climate change politically, socially, culturally, technologically. And the real fun piece for me was building all of these different factions that responded to the world falling apart in very different ways and had very different outcomes and thought processes of where they need to go and what's going on. So you've got this group of people who really kind of go back to basics and see it as this very religious experience where the gods are punishing us for, like, the world was going to end. And then we turned around and said, we will not go go off into that gentle night. We're going to fight and we're going to save the world. And they did, sort of. And this group of people says, okay, maybe we did this thing wrong because life sucks and we're suffering and the world is still kind of turning in the direction of getting rid of us. So maybe we did the wrong thing and we made somebody really angry. And they kind of go back to this idea of the ancient Greek gods and, the idea from, ancient Greece, where a lot of, like with a lot of religions, the things that happened in the world were ascribed, that we couldn't explain, were ascribed to the gods. So if something happened, if a plague came through or a crop wasn't, as bountiful as you would want it to be, you'd say, I did something to make Demeter mad at me, so she made my crop go fallow and I'm being punished for something. Okay, well, I've got to go fix that, whatever that was.
I've finished my novel. It's ready to submit to publishers. Pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah. I get it.
But yeah, it came in as this piece that it was a really fun thing to be able to explore this aspect of, like, how are human beings going to react? And we're already not reacting the best, but when things really get bad, how are we going to react to this? And then bringing in mythology. I love mythology. I'm named after a mythological hero, after all. So
there's Odin reference. There's a Castor and Pollux reference in there. There's
which is the one that nobody has really picked up on yet, which is interesting.
Well, here, I'll point out that my copy of the book is dog-eared. Maybe this is a first for you too, to see your book desecrated and written on and little notes made.
I'm fine with writing on it because during university, I was the person that would write in the margins and, like, underline things.
That's right. Oh, and this may be the first time you've ever heard this term. We may have to bleep it, but it's called marginalia. And you do that somewhat slightly rude sounding. Dystopia, cyberpunk, climate fiction can kind of seem like a downer.
Yeah.
But the book is fast-paced, pretty exciting. There's lots of twists, there's some great humor. Why don't you tell us about the fun you had putting these characters through their paces?
Yeah, these are characters that I love writing for. And they kind of just developed in this way that really developed very naturally. And some of the characters definitely changed over time, like the character of Maria, who you meet fairly early in the book. She went through a lot of iterations of who she was and what her role was in the story.
Can you talk about that?
Well, originally there was a different love interest for Nikos throughout the book. And I was using this, it was going to be basically the standard, girl next door narrative where this person moves in next door to him and she is pretty much like the opposite of what he was. He's this rich kid that lives, down in the bowels of the city, and he's on the side of the criminal justice arm of society. And she's the person who looks at him and says, "You're doing this wrong. I'm fighting to save the people from having you on their tail every single day." And that character went through a journey, and it was one of those things in one of the drafts, and an idea that kind of percolated to the surface in talking with Melissa was like, okay, maybe we shift her to be somebody who comes back, somebody that he knew. And that developed into this kind of core group of friends, because it was really, initially it was Nikos, his best friend Mac, and Mac's brother Trapper, who the three of them were kind of a tight-knit unit. And then adding in Maria added a new dimension, and this kind of found family came through, and I got to really have fun with building lore for these stuff that didn't even make it into the book, but journeys that they went on and how their friendships formed and little things like that made writing them so much fun.
To the assembled masses, substantive editing is when an editor will come in from the publisher and suggest elements that can strengthen the story. They don't tell you how to do it. They will just say, here are some pieces in the climate, pun intended, of your story that maybe you could change the weather if you add some things. Isn't that the most delicious note when you agree with the substantive editing?
Exactly. It makes it it makes it a very collaborative experience. And I think it was really great because, you sit there and you write this thing and you have one view of it. And in a very Stephen King way, you write the first draft with the door closed. You write it for you, something you enjoy and the story you want to tell. And then you write the second draft with the door open. And that's bringing in editors, that's rewriting the story with the audience in mind and how they'll see it and how they'll take it in. So having that feedback and being able to go back and tweak things, and even in a lot of parts, substantially change elements to the story, where I think it helped me really reframe how I viewed parts of the story, and in a real way kill your darlings and get rid of things that I really liked and thought were cool. But it's okay, I'm gonna delete this from the draft. I'm gonna save it on a different document and just hold on to it for a rainy day if I need it in the future. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience. And I've worked with editors for a long time. So I'm kind of used to having somebody come in and say, this needs to change. This isn't as good as you want it to be. So let's take it in a different direction.
A difficult skill to develop.
Yeah.
Are there any characters that you killed that you wish you hadn't? In a book, I've made this mistake before. I get so tuned into the tension of a scene, and then I decide that the only thing to do is take that character everyone likes and make them suffer. And then maybe the book comes out and I go, oh, I really like them. I wish they had lived.
I mean, there are definitely, I don't know if there's any ones that I've regretted killing, because I think it definitely serves the narrative for those sacrifices. There are deaths that I took out.
Are there any you wish lasted longer?
I think the abruptness in itself often is almost worse, where a little spoiler here, but I'm writing the third book, just drafting out that book. And there is a character death in there, and it happens like that. And the impact is the fact that you think you're fine, you think you're in control, and then, oh no, your friend just died right next to you.
That's our hint. It's one of their group. You monster. We haven't even started to like them yet, and we know they didn't all make it.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So it's part of a series, but it stands on its own really firmly, I think, as a novel on its own. If there were no other, if a meteorite strikes the Earth, they'll be satisfied with one book.
Yeah,
be fine.
And that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to leave it on this big cliffhanger that's not going to be satisfied unless I, follow it up. I wanted there just to be this kind of tight narrative, and it ends in a way where it's like, all right, the door's open.
The afterward feels like an after credits scene.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's the doors open to continue it moving forward, but if you just leave it there, you leave it there, and it kind of has a pretty satisfactory resolution.
Writing a novel can be very difficult. It can be fraught with self-doubt, deadline pressure, knowing that you could do more with more time, but only having the time you've been given. What have you learned in writing this first novel that you're applying to the second and third?
I think I'm being a lot more critical in a good way, in being very realistic about how long certain scenes will last and how long the narrative will last and how many twists and turns there are going to be, and being very good at kind of trimming the fat. If there's a chapter that, for me, like if it doesn't serve pushing the narrative forward or helping you learn about the characters in an important way, or giving you pieces of information that you need as the narrative goes on, just a cool scene, just cut it. Don't throw it in the bin, save it, because a lot of the times they're really fun. There are...
Use it on your D&D group.
Exactly. There are full chapters of backstory for Nikos as a character that were great, and I really liked writing them, and I thought they were really effective scenes, but they really felt like they either dragged the narrative down, slowed it down, or didn't really add much. So I'm being much better about acknowledging that, okay, I might like this scene, but it doesn't really fit with what's going on right now, and I have to...
Yeah, scenes that you think you realize as you're writing, you need to write them in order to understand what happens next.
Yeah.
But no one needs to read them in order to understand what happens.
Yeah, there was in this book, there was an argument between Maria and Nikos that lasted for pages and pages and pages. And it was this really emotional argument that the two of them have, but it didn't serve the narrative for where it was going. And it slowed things down. It took it in a direction that, didn't really suit moving forward. So I stripped it down, moved pieces of it around, and didn't quite get rid of it, but was able to cut it down in a sense where it didn't really drag on as long as it did before.
So I want to come back around to something that you said about the inconvenient truth, right? The DVD, the documentary that you subjected your family to, change your life. But, nonfiction documentary can only reach a certain willing readership or a certain willing audience. Yeah. What do you think the role of teaching through imagination, which is really what climate fiction is, had on the work that you were doing once you decided that this was the voice you wanted to put into it?
I think it definitely was part of the thought process. So I have a master's degree in sociology, and there's a concept in sociology called public sociology, where it's a kind of an avenue of thought or a way of understanding our work, where we acknowledge that the true value of the work that we do is not to impress our colleagues or get referenced in different journals and satisfy all the check boxes that you need for the tenure track position. It's, will the average person learn from this? Will they have their mind changed? Will they be able to move forward with new knowledge, new context for things? Will it affect them in a very important way? And I think that literature and art, in kind of a broader sense, has the ability to convey some of these ideas in a way that gets people's, mind rolling a little bit. You can only sit there and lecture at somebody about, the future of the planet and how we need to change all of these things is for so much until their ears kind of shut off and they start ignoring you. But if you wrap it in this narrative that is impactful and fun and interesting, you can really kind of sneak, not like a malicious way, but sneak in those ideas to get them thinking. You don't want to make them make a decision, but you want to get people thinking. And I think the best writing makes you think a little bit.
And good science fiction isn't talking about the future at all. It's talking about the present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's always about the mistakes we're making right now and symbolizing that in something broader.
What's a mistake that we're making right now that your character makes in the book?
I think the big one is trusting the structure that he is a part of to solve the problem effectively. And there are issues present in the narrative that he acknowledges that, like, there are things that I'm doing that are perpetuating this really bad thing, and people are being, kind of oppressed in a way by actions of people like me. And I'm trying my best, but I know that it's not enough. And he continually tries to make it work as he moves forward. And as the narrative progresses and, it kind of goes on and the world starts to evolve after the first book, it really gets left in a spot where it's like, okay, things are starting to turn, and the happy, fun adventure is starting to turn into something really different. And the characters have to start reckoning with the fact that, okay, maybe we are complicit in something that's not great here. And how do we change the system that we're in?
Speaking of complicity and things that might not be great, and speaking also about a point that in the 80s was science fiction and is now science fact, your main character has an onboard AI, Odin, advisor. Where do you feel we are? How deep into Pandora's box are we with AI right now?
We are at a point of no return. I don't think we are going to get to the point of like HAL 9000, where the machine or the Skynet future. But I think it is a box that we have opened, and it is a path we have gone down that we can't turn away from. So we need to understand, because we're not going to be able to, there's 10 billion people on planet Earth. We can't just all collectively stand there and say, okay, we're never touching AI again. It is tied into too many things already, and the Pandora's box is open. We have to deal with the world we have right now. How do we continue on safely? And
it has the feeling that my kindergarten teacher had. Now this is a way back machine, but you won't always have a calculator in your pocket. You're going to have to learn to do this math. And now it's, you won't always have a super intelligent computer language model in your pocket. Oh, wait. Yes, we will. So what role does that technology, it doesn't come to, it's not in conflict in the story so much as it's just interwoven as a tool.
Yeah, and it's, so
I wanted more dire warnings about AI in your book. They were less than I expected.
The unfortunate thing is, like, the book was done and then ChatGPT became a thing. And I was like, well, great. Now I missed an opportunity here because I was too fast. But I think that it is used really as a tool, and it's it's explored a little bit in the book, but like Odin is exceptional. He is a very special piece of technology, but has been learning from this person over the course of a decade. So they kind of just like mirror each other in a very interesting way. But AI, like a lot of the technologies present, are tools for maintaining the world and kind of using it moving forward. And there is a future of AI where, it takes over the really mundane tasks of our day-to-day life, things that we don't want to have to do or don't do as well as we potentially could. And that's kind of the avenue where AI kind of fits more traditionally in the narrative up until the point of the book, where it is starting to evolve in this new direction. And then we're reckoning with, okay, we're adding this new capability to this thing, and it's just something that it hasn't touched before. Are we reaching the limits of this technology?
Let's reach the limits of our audience here, both online and in the present. And remember that since this is your debut novel, we should call this portion the shameless self-promotion portion of the story. So I'm going to ask you to frame the story the following way. Stories are very simple machines. There's somebody somewhere wants something, and then a complication ensues.
Yes.
Which gives us a way to promote the story without giving too many spoilers. So tell the audience that may not know as deeply as we do, because we came here having read the book, who the somebody, the something, what it is they want, and what's going wrong.
Nikos Wulf is a bounty hunter living in 2120s Winnipeg who wants to keep his city safe and free from ecological collapse. And then a new, more militant player enters the scene and tries to destroy everything he is fighting to protect.
Dun, dun, dun. Gunfights and hilarity ensue. What's something that you haven't been asked that you were, when we were trading emails, you thought, okay, well, I hope he'll come around to a certain point of view at a certain point where I can shoehorn in this point? Is there a special thank you? Is there a notion about the book that you've wanted to talk to? What's the question you wish I had asked you?
I mean, probably something to do with how I see our response to climate change actually playing out.
Okay, let's do this. Jason,
yes.
How do you see our response to climate change actually playing out in the context of
That's
our
a
own
fantastic
future?
question. I'm glad that you asked it.
Oh, well, I came prepared.
Yeah. In researching for the book and learning more about what we're doing right now, I think we have this notion as a society that to kind of push back against climate change and save the planet, we have to substantially change our lives, and we all have to start driving electric cars, and everyone has to do this, that, and the other thing, purchase these products versus these products, and make these decisions versus these decisions. And in doing the research, I found out that we really don't have to change our lives that substantially to protect our planet. Pollution comes from three main sources that make up about 90% of our pollution. It's energy production, manufacturing, and shipping. It is making things.
So buy your book locally.
Yes.
It's an important point.
Support local bookstores.
Check that third one off.
Yeah. It is making things, moving those things around, and making sure that all of that stuff can run. Those are the three main things. We here in Manitoba have solved one of those things already, doing it in a green way. We invested in hydro technology decades before everybody else, because we had the resources to do it in terms of rivers, and we were able to build dams, and now about 98% of our electricity comes from hydroelectric power. The other 2% is propane. So we've kind of figured out that, yeah, you can do that. If we use solar panels, wind farms, geothermal, hydroelectricity, we can reduce our emissions by an immense amount. If we change manufacturing by powering it using green technologies, that brings the emissions of manufacturing down. If we change the way that we ship the components to build the things that we need, there's no reason why, a chip should be mined in this country, sent across the world to be turned into a chip in this country and sent the other corner of the world to be put into a circuit board and sent to this other corner of the world to be put into a calculator and then shipped all the way back around to the country next to the country where the initial thing was mined to be able to be sold.
You used the Marshall McLuhan quote at the moment of Sputnik here. On spaceship Earth, there are no passengers. Everybody is a member of the crew.
Yes.
So we all got to do our part, but we don't have to throw anyone overboard.
Yeah. You got things like tulip turbines, which are about yay high, that can, you stick one on the roof of your house or on your garage, and that can take a chunk of your energy needs and be generated in a very efficient way. There are carbon recapture technologies, things like that have been created by Climeworks, which is an Icelandic company, which they have cells that are about this big, like a large air conditioning unit that you'd put out the back of your house, and it just air cycles through it. The carbon is stripped out of the air, and then you remove the filter after a while and dispose of it somehow, and that actively removes carbon from the atmosphere. And it's just something that exists, and you can put them on top of apartment buildings and factories and skyscrapers and things. There are very small things that we can do that can make a huge impact as a society.
Yeah, from the billions on the planet, that means there's billions of ideas we can use to fix it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's come back around to the indelible realm of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
In your story, you have some interesting villains.
Yes.
And at the risk of this seeming, you studied sociology,
Yes.
so you know the effect this will have on the crowd as we talk about the evils in your world. Why don't you talk to us about who the bad guys are? I found them not as one note as you usually discover in a debut author.
Yeah, I think at its heart, anybody who makes a poor decision has reasons behind those decisions. And in a world like this, it's hard to write a story where somebody is part of the criminal justice apparatus and not have to reckon with concepts like poverty and education and access to resources and all of these things. So when I was showing kind of the villains of the story, I wanted them to be coming from a place that kind of makes sense. And I think the most effective villains are ones that you can look at and say, okay, well, you've got a good point there about X, Y, and Z. Maybe your methods are wrong, but the reasons why you're doing things might be a little bit okay.
Yeah, the book has a lot of desperate people doing desperate things.
Yeah, and it was really intentional to take kind of the bad guys of the narrative from being, gang members to anti-establishment groups. There are people that have kind of come together under very certain circumstances with common goals and values in mind, and they are kind of intrinsic to the community that they're a part of. They are part of legitimate and illegitimate business. They do things that help people as well as things that might hurt people. So it's, where did those people fit into this structure that's been in place for the average person who might have been left behind by society?
In terms of anti-establishment, in flagrant violation to the rules that have just been passed, I'm going to offer 2 minutes for audience questions.
Yes.
Take that, John, back there. Is there a burning question from the audience? Because since this is your first launch, you've got to have your first question from the audience. Yeah, let's go over that. Perfect segue into establishment there. So we're breaking the rules now. Too close to the sun.
So you've talked a lot about the just varying difficult themes and thematic presences of your setting, book, and story. A lot of them are very sensitive to the modern audience. What was the most challenging one to tackle gracefully, and how did you do it?
Good first question.
I mean,
I don't have to answer.
It's one that I think when you write a story in Canada, you can't escape. And it is, how do I take the concept of colonialism and the history of our country as it is now, and how do I handle some of the darker moments and pieces and realities of this world and do it in a way that is sensitive to the actual lived experiences of people in the current day. And there are characters, I deliberately went out and made sure that, basically every facet of Manitoban society is represented. There are people from various diverse cultural, gender backgrounds and different, ethnic and economic backgrounds. So how do I have a couple main characters who are from from an Indigenous community? And how do I make sure that as a person who is not Indigenous, that I can represent them in the most respectful way and make sure I don't, unintentionally do something that, or represent them in a way that is kind of problematic. So there was a lot of work to make sure that, when there are, people of color or different gender backgrounds, because I am kind of the standard, straight, white, cisgendered guy, how do I represent diverse characters and diverse peoples and diverse communities in the most respectful way possible?
Good answer. As a similar member of the global minority, which is how we should see ourselves, right? It can be very challenging, and I think something that a lot of first-time authors skip at their detriment. So the fact that you thought about it carefully and you were shepherded in by Turnstone appropriately, I think that's great. Now, I am getting the look from the great and powerful Oz that says I should remind you that if you pick up copies of the book or you took them from the stands here, he's happy to sign them. And we'll be doing that over there by cash, but please make sure you pay for them before you leave. It's an important step. And I'll also mention to all the assembled masses and anyone listening, if you don't have a copy of the book, you can't get it handily, ask your library to bring it in. This has a huge effect, both for the publisher and for independent bookstores and for the author directly. So support your libraries. How's that, John?
That was excellent. Thank you kindly, Gregory. And Jason, if you have any closing comments you might like to make, please feel free.
Said the voice of the air.
Voice of God speaking down to me. I think, just kind of what I want to say is, for all of you who are here, my most heartfelt thank you for taking the time out of your days and your evenings, the people who have sent me messages and offered their congratulations, or the people that I don't know that are here. Thank you for, giving this a chance and coming to listen to me ramble for a while. Writing can be a very lonely process. It was a lot of me sitting with the door closed and scribbling down on something, and my mom reminding me, hey, you need to have dinner. It's sitting out here. And then, when I move in with my lovely girlfriend, Miranda, her reminding me, hey, we haven't made dinner yet. You should probably come over here and help me. Having people come and support this work, makes it all worthwhile. I didn't enter this process with the lofty ambitions of, getting the show put on like HBO and selling 1 million copies. I just wanted to do this thing. I wanted to publish a novel and have my name sitting on a bookshelf somewhere. And that was all that I cared about. But seeing people enjoy it and support it has been an amazing experience for me. So thank you all for being here.
Bravo.
Thank you so much, Jason. And Gregory has taken care of a good number of the signing details. Just 2 things I'll mention. The first is that I'll ask you all just to remain in place for 1 moment while we safely transport Jason to the signing table, just over by the cash desk, and I'll let you know where he's settled and you can come over and join us. The other thing I'll mention is that we have books at both the cash desk and the signing table, so avail yourself of them at either location. We're so enormously grateful to Turnstone Press / Ravenstone, their imprint, for publishing this book and for helping to put on this evening. Of course, to GMB Chomichuk for being such an incredible host. To all of you, both here and virtually, for joining us. And I'll ask you to join me one more time in giving Jason Pchajek a very warm round of applause.